Lyanna Walker, 18 years old, a top FBI trainee, was just one step away from entering the world of law enforcement. But instead of wearing the badge of justice, she found herself in handcuffs like a criminal. The police arrested her on a mistaken identity, or was there something more behind it? Can she prove her innocence and turn the tables? This story will make you outraged, keep you on edge, and in the end, fill you with hope. If you believe no one should be treated unfairly like this, hit like and share your thoughts. Now let's dive into this shocking story. The night was quiet, the air still thick with the scent of rain. Streetlights cast a dim glow on the wet pavement, their reflections stretching long and distorted beneath the weight of the city's silence. It was the kind of night where everything felt calm, where nothing seemed out of place. But that was the danger, wasn't it? How quickly a moment of peace could turn into something else entirely. Lyanna Walker walked with steady strides, her breath measured, her mind still buzzing with the energy from her last debate club meeting. The world felt wide open to her, every step bringing her closer to a future she had fought for. At 18, she had already done what few could dream of, graduating from the FBI Accelerated Youth Academy, an elite program designed for the best and brightest. 2 years of training had pushed her beyond her limits, sharpening her instincts, honing her skills, and now she was on the cusp of something bigger, a highly sought-after internship with the Bureau, the next step toward becoming an agent. Her certification was tucked neatly inside her bag, hidden within a side compartment, a simple piece of paper, yet proof of everything she had worked for. More than that, it was a symbol of what she believed in. Justice. Fairness. The idea that the system, despite its flaws, could be made better. But systems, as she would soon learn, do not always work the way they should. Up ahead, a commotion caught her eye. Red and blue lights flickered against the windows of a convenience store at the corner, their glow washing over the damp asphalt. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered slightly in the breeze. Officers moved with urgency, their voices sharp, their body language rigid. Even from a distance, she could sense the tension in the air. Something had happened. Instinct told her to keep walking, to stay in her lane. But instinct also told her something else, that her presence here in this moment might be a problem. A cold prickle ran down her spine as she noticed a pair of officers glance in her direction. It was a look she had seen before, one that lingered just a little too long, one that carried weight, that carried suspicion. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just heading home, but suddenly that didn't seem to matter. "Hey you, stop right there!" The words sliced through the night, sharp and absolute. Lyanna froze, her pulse spiked, pounding in her ears. She turned her head slowly, her breath catching as 2 officers locked onto her, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Hands up, now!" It wasn't a request, it was an order. A hush fell over the street. A few bystanders paused, watching, uncertain. Somewhere nearby, a car's engine hummed, indifferent to the moment unfolding in front of them. Lyanna knew what to do. She had been taught this. Keep still, move slow, speak calmly. But as she raised her hands, as she looked into the hard-set faces of the men before her, an uneasy truth settled in her chest. They weren't looking for answers. They had already decided. The air around her felt heavier now, as if the night itself had conspired to close in. Lyanna kept her hands raised, fingers trembling slightly despite her best efforts to steady them. She had been trained for high-pressure situations, had learned to assess threats, to stay calm in moments of crisis. But nothing in her training had prepared her for this, because nothing about this was supposed to happen. A pair of boots scuffed against the pavement as one of the officers stepped forward. Graham O'Donnell, mid-40s, thick-set, with the kind of face that had seen years of authority go unquestioned. His partner, Derek Marston, younger but cut from the same cloth, hung back slightly, scanning the street with a wary gaze. O'Donnell looked her over, his eyes moving from her face to her hoodie, down to her jeans, then back up again. It was subtle, but Lyanna recognized it for what it was, an evaluation, a silent confirmation of whatever conclusion he had already reached. "You match the description." The words landed like a slap. Lyanna swallowed, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Sir, I don't know what." "Don't move." O'Donnell cut her off, tone sharp, warning. He lifted a hand toward Marston. Suspect fits the details. Hoodie, jeans, female, mid to late teens. His partner nodded, already reaching for the cuffs. This is a mistake, Lyanna tried again, heart pounding. I was just walking home. You can check my ID. We'll check everything when you're in custody. O'Donnell's voice was clipped, final. He exchanged a glance with Marston. She could have an accomplice nearby. Cuff her now. Lyanna's stomach dropped. The moment the cold steel snapped around her wrists, the reality of it hit her like a freight train. She was under arrest, and nothing she said would change that. Lyanna's pulse pounded in her ears, her breath shallow as she forced herself to stay still, to not make a single move that could be misinterpreted. The moment O'Donnell's gaze locked onto her, she felt it, that unspoken verdict that had already been passed. It didn't matter where she had been or what she had done. She could see it in the way his eyes narrowed, in the way his hand hovered near his holster. He wasn't searching for the truth. He was searching for confirmation. O'Donnell took a slow step forward, sizing her up, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. Female, hoodie, jeans, he murmured, half to himself, half to his partner. She matches. The words made her stomach turn. Lyanna opened her mouth, forcing herself to sound measured, rational, anything but afraid. Sir, please, I was just walking home. I haven't done anything wrong. O'Donnell barely looked at her. Where were you an hour ago? At school. You can check. Do you have anyone with you? Marston cut in, his eyes scanning the darkened streets, hand already reaching for the cuffs. She could have an accomplice nearby. Accomplice? The word sent a cold shock through her veins. They weren't just assuming she had done something, they were building a case against her in real time, twisting the details to fit whatever picture they wanted to paint. Lyanna's breath caught in her throat. No, Turn around, O'Donnell ordered. The weight of the moment came crashing down, pressing against her chest like a vice. They weren't listening. They weren't going to listen. And as Marston grabbed her wrist and twisted her arms behind her back, as the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut, she realized something else. They had never planned to. Marston's grip tightened around her arm as he yanked the backpack from her shoulder. The rough motion nearly threw her off balance, but she clenched her jaw, steadying herself. Her heart pounded as she watched him unzip the main compartment and shove his hand inside, fingers rifling through her belongings without care. Her textbooks, her notebook, her water bottle, all discarded onto the pavement like meaningless clutter. Then he froze. His hand emerged, clutching a crisp, official-looking document. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, Lyanna could see the bold, unmistakable letters across the top. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marston's brows furrowed as he flipped it open, scanning the contents. For a brief second, confusion flickered across his face, a crack in the certainty with which they had treated her. He glanced toward O'Donnell, as if unsure of what he had just found. Lyanna seized the moment, desperation creeping into her voice. That's mine, she said quickly, her arms still pinned behind her back. I completed my training with the FBI youth program. You can verify. O'Donnell snatched the certificate from Marston's hand, his expression hardening as he skimmed the page. His lips curled into something between amusement and disdain. Oh, this is rich, he muttered, holding the paper up like it was a cheap counterfeit. So what, you're telling me you're an FBI agent now? No, Lyanna said, struggling to keep the edge of frustration out of her voice. But I trained with them. I have contacts. You have contacts? O'Donnell cut in, his eyes darkening. So what? I'm supposed to believe some 18-year-old girl is working with the feds? He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. But then, just as quickly, the humor drained from his face. A beat of silence passed, heavy and thick. Then, without warning, he tightened his grip on the cuffs, yanking them sharply, making Lyanna hiss in pain. You know what I think? O'Donnell murmured, his voice lowering to something more dangerous. He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. I think this is fake. Lyanna's stomach turned. You're not just a robbery suspect, he continued, voice dripping with mockery. You're looking at a federal offense now, impersonating a government agent. Panic seized her chest. No, that's not. O'Donnell turned to Marston, waving the certificate in the air. Bag it. She's coming in. Marston hesitated, glancing down at the document once more. His silence was the first real sign of doubt either of them had shown all night. But it didn't matter. O'Donnell had already made his decision. And in his eyes, the piece of paper that should have saved her had just sealed her fate. A murmur spread through the small crowd that had begun to gather along the sidewalk. A few bystanders had already pulled out their phones, their screens glowing in the darkness as they recorded everything. The flashing lights, the officers, the girl in handcuffs who had done nothing wrong. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice rang out. A woman's, sharp, unwavering. "That girl goes to Benjamin High. She's one of the top students. She's not a criminal." Others began to chime in. "She didn't do anything. Let her go." "Why are you arresting her? What's the charge?" Lyanna turned toward the voices, her pulse surging with hope. Maybe, just maybe, if enough people saw this, if enough people spoke up, someone would listen. But O'Donnell didn't flinch. He barely even acknowledged the growing unrest. Marston cast a quick glance at the crowd, his fingers twitching at his belt, but he didn't loosen his grip on Lyanna's arm. "Back up," O'Donnell ordered flatly, waving a dismissive hand at the onlookers. "Get out of the street." The woman who had spoken up took a step forward, fury written across her face. "This is wrong," she shouted. "She's just a kid. She hasn't done anything." O'Donnell turned to her then, his eyes dark and impassive. "Step back, ma'am," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a warning. The crowd shifted uneasily, their outrage tempered by something heavier now, fear. They had seen this before. They had seen what happened when people pushed too hard, when they refused to move, so they did the only thing they could. They kept filming. Lyanna felt a tight knot of despair form in her chest as O'Donnell yanked her forward. Marston grabbed the door handle, pulling it open. "No, please," she tried again, struggling to be heard over the rising tension. "You're making a mistake." But her words were swallowed by the slam of the car door. The cold leather of the seat pressed against her back as she was shoved inside, the heavy clang of the door locking her in. The crowd blurred through the tinted glass, faces she didn't know, voices she couldn't reach. And as the patrol car pulled away, Lyanna felt the weight of it all settle on her like a crushing force. No one was coming to help. Not tonight. The air inside the precinct was thick, stagnant, sterile, heavy with the scent of old coffee and something metallic, like cold steel and paperwork left too long in damp air. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unflattering glare against the scuffed linoleum floors. It was a place meant for order, for justice. But standing there, Lyanna felt like she had stepped into a machine designed to strip her of both. The moment the doors slammed shut behind her, she became just another case number. They processed her swiftly, mechanically, with the kind of efficiency that came from doing something 1,000 times before. No hesitation, no concern, no curiosity about who she was, only what box they could put her into. Face forward. The officer's voice was flat, devoid of anything resembling humanity. A camera flash went off, momentarily blinding her. She barely had time to blink before they pulled her toward the fingerprint station. A thick, calloused hand gripped her wrist, forcing her fingers down onto the ink pad. The ink was cold, smearing onto her skin as her prints were rolled onto the paper, one by one. Thumb, index, middle, ring, pinky. Then again for the scanner. The black smudges on her fingertips felt permanent, like a stain she couldn't wash away. Lyanna inhaled deeply, forcing herself to remember everything she had been taught. Stay calm, observe, look for an opening. She let her eyes move cautiously around the room. Officers shuffled papers, filled out reports, leaned against their desks engaged in casual conversation. One was laughing, shaking his head at something on his phone. Another stirred his coffee, yawning, as if the night were moving too slowly for his liking. None of them looked at her. None of them acknowledged her as anything more than a process to be completed, a form to be filed away. Her wrists ached where the cuffs had been, raw from the ride over. She flexed her fingers slightly, but it did nothing to shake the deep, bone-deep exhaustion setting in. She had spent years believing in the system, believing that justice, though flawed, was real. That if she ever found herself in trouble, all she had to do was explain, to present the facts, and she would be heard. But the facts didn't matter here. The truth didn't matter here. To them, she wasn't a student, a scholar, or an aspiring agent. She wasn't someone who had trained in their world, who had studied their laws, who had believed in their promises of fairness. She was just another suspect. Another body in the system. And as she was led down a dimly lit hallway, past rows of holding cells with faces watching from behind iron bars, the weight of that realization settled deep in her chest. There was no getting out of this. Not on her own. The tires screeched against the pavement as Lyanna Walker pulled into the police station's parking lot, barely shifting the car into park before throwing the door open. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts, but she forced herself to keep moving. She didn't have time for fear. She had barely made it through the front doors when she saw the officer at the desk glance up, his expression impassive, indifferent, as if she were just another inconvenience to be dealt with. "My daughter," she said, her voice sharp, unwavering. "Where is she?" The officer barely lifted a brow. "Name?" "Lyanna Walker. You brought her in less than an hour ago. I want to see her." The officer exhaled through his nose, reaching for a clipboard. "She's being processed," he said, flipping through the pages with a lazy sort of disinterest. "She'll be held overnight while we conduct an investigation." Davina's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "Investigation?" she repeated, her voice rising. "On what grounds? What are the charges?" The officer's eyes flicked toward her then, the barest trace of irritation crossing his features. "Ma'am, I suggest you calm down." "Don't." The word cut through the air like a blade. Davina took a single step forward, her body rigid with barely contained fury. "Don't tell me to calm down while my child is locked up for something she didn't do." The officer straightened slightly, but his expression remained unchanged. "Your daughter is in police custody. You'll be notified if any formal charges are filed." The words landed like a punch to the gut. If any formal charges are filed. Meaning they didn't have anything. Meaning they had no real case. Meaning they had taken her baby girl and thrown her into a holding cell simply because they could. Davina felt the tremor in her hands before she clenched them tighter, forcing herself to focus. Panicking wouldn't help Lyanna. Screaming wouldn't help Lyanna. But she knew who would. She turned on her heel, yanking her phone from her pocket as she stormed toward the exit. Her fingers moved fast, finding the contact she never thought she'd need. Michael Keene. The man who had built his career fighting for the falsely accused. The man who had taken on cases no one else dared to touch. The man who, right now, was the only person who could stand between her daughter and a system that had already decided she was guilty. She pressed the call button, lifting the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice, then a voice, smooth and steady, answered on the other end. "Davina," she exhaled, steadying herself. "I need your help." Lyanna sat on the cold metal bench inside the holding cell, her arms wrapped around herself as if that alone could keep the walls from closing in. The station was alive with noise, phones ringing, officers chatting, the clatter of keys against a desk, but it all felt distant, like she was trapped inside a soundproof box where nothing she said would ever be heard. She had tried, at first, tried to reason, to explain, to make them listen. But they didn't care. Her throat was dry, her muscles stiff from sitting so still for so long. She had always thought she was strong, that she could handle pressure, but this wasn't a test. There was no examiner waiting to give her feedback, no controlled environment where she could reset and try again. This was real. And for the first time since the nightmare began, a terrifying thought crept into her mind. What if no one came? The weight of it pressed down on her chest, her fingers digging into the fabric of her hoodie. She forced herself to breathe, to stay calm, but the walls felt tighter now, the air heavier. And then, just as her last shred of resolve began to slip, a voice cut through the noise. "She doesn't say another word unless I'm present." The words were not shouted, not barked, but they carried a force that silenced the room, a presence that commanded attention. Lyanna looked up. Standing in the doorway was a man in a dark suit, his coat still dusted with the chill of the night air. His gaze was sharp, unreadable, moving swiftly from the officers at the desk to the ones stationed near the cells. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't uncertain. Michael Keene. The shift was instant. The officers who had ignored her, who had treated her like an afterthought, now suddenly looked uncomfortable. One of them cleared his throat. Another adjusted his stance. Keene stepped further into the room, his expression giving away nothing, but his presence alone seemed to tilt the balance of power ever so slightly. Lyanna's chest rose with an unsteady breath. For the first time since this began, she wasn't alone. The courtroom was silent, except for the steady ticking of the clock on the far wall. Tension thickened the air, wrapping around every person seated in that room. The gallery was packed. Reporters, onlookers, and a handful of familiar faces who had come to witness justice, or the lack thereof. Lyanna sat stiffly at the defense table, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Every time she reminded herself to breathe, another wave of fear crashed over her. The system she had spent her life believing in was now trying to crush her under its weight. Across the room, Emma Branson, the prosecutor, stood tall, exuding the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether justice would bend to her will. She turned toward the jury, voice smooth, measured, calculated. "The facts are simple," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. A robbery occurred. The suspect fled. Multiple witnesses saw a young black female in a hoodie near the scene shortly after. And now, the defendant wants us to believe she was just an innocent bystander, that she just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She let the words settle, turning toward the man seated in the witness stand. "Mr. Hawkins, you testified that you saw this young woman outside the convenience store the night of the robbery. Are you certain it was her?" The man in the chair, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and shifting eyes, cleared his throat. "Yeah, I saw her there, right after the sirens." Branson nodded as if the answer had been scripted. "No further questions, Your Honor." Keene exhaled slowly through his nose, then rose from his chair. He straightened his jacket with a deliberate ease before pacing toward the witness stand. "Mr. Hawkins," Keene's voice was steady, unshaken. "You claim you saw my client that night. Can you tell us exactly what time that was?" Hawkins shifted slightly in his seat, licking his lips. Sometime after dark? Maybe around 8:30? 8:30, Keene repeated, nodding slightly as if he were confirming a crucial detail. "And what time was the robbery reported?" 8:45. Keene paused for effect before delivering the next blow. "And where was my client at that time?" A murmur rippled through the gallery. Branson immediately shot up from her seat. "Objection. The witness cannot be expected to know." "Overruled," the judge interjected, eyes flicking toward Hawkins. The man's face tightened. He hesitated. I don't know." Keene tilted his head slightly, the ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "Then allow me to clarify. My client was at school, specifically inside a monitored building, surrounded by teachers, classmates, and security cameras that recorded her location at the exact time of the crime." The gallery erupted into hushed whispers. Branson's jaw tightened. "That's impossible," she snapped, her tone sharper now. "If that were true, why didn't she say so the night she was arrested?" Keene didn't flinch. Perhaps because she was in handcuffs before she even had the chance to speak. Silence fell like a hammer. For the first time, a flicker of doubt passed over Branson's face. But she recovered quickly. She took a slow breath, then turned toward the evidence table. With a swift motion, she lifted a clear plastic bag containing Lyanna's FBI training certificate. She held it up for the jury to see, her voice carrying through the courtroom. "Let's assume for a moment that the timeline doesn't align. That still doesn't explain this." She took a step closer, the plastic crinkling in her grip. An 18-year-old with an official-looking government document. She let the words hang before delivering her next line with razor-sharp precision. "What else could it be but a forgery?" She turned toward the jury, her expression full of manufactured disbelief. "This is no coincidence. The defendant isn't just a confused teenager caught in the wrong place. She was playing the system, pretending to be something she's not. We have no proof that this document is real." Lyanna's stomach twisted. Branson wasn't just trying to prove her guilty. She was trying to erase everything she had worked for, twisting the very thing that should have exonerated her into something suspicious. Keene was already shaking his head. "You're reaching, counselor. That certificate is real, and we can prove it." Branson let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, and what proof do you have?" Keene turned slightly, his jaw tightening, his gaze steady as it flicked toward the double doors at the back of the courtroom. "They'll be here soon." Branson frowned. "Who?" Keene adjusted his cufflinks, the hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. "The FBI. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The weight of the moment pressed down on Lyanna's chest like a leaden force, making it nearly impossible to breathe. She could feel it, the way the tide had shifted against her. The jury was listening to Branson now, not to the evidence, not to the truth, but to Branson's narrative, the compelling story she had spun with just enough confidence to make doubt fester. The look in the juror's eyes wasn't one of certainty, but it was close. Branson knew it too. She stood tall, her hands braced against the evidence table, her voice steady and assured. "The facts don't lie," she said smoothly. "The defense can try to twist the timeline all they want, but this certificate, she lifted the bag document higher, is nothing more than an attempt to manipulate the system, and we will not let that happen." Keene remained still, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken since he'd said, "They'll be here soon." And then, as if summoned by the sheer weight of those words, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the silent chamber. Every head in the gallery turned. Even the judge's gavel, mid-motion, paused in the air. Two men in dark suits strode inside. Their movements were deliberate, precise, the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but commanded it nonetheless. The lead agent, tall, sharp-eyed, with a badge clipped to his belt, walked with a sense of quiet authority. In his hand he carried a thick, manila folder. Without breaking stride, he approached the judge's bench, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. He stopped beside the evidence table, his presence a direct challenge to Branson's confidence. The agent set the folder down, his gaze locked onto the prosecutor. Then, with calm finality, he spoke. "That certificate is real." Branson blinked. "It was issued by the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the agent continued, his voice even but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "Miss Walker is a graduate of our Accelerated Youth Academy. In fact, she was one of the most outstanding trainees in her class." The silence shattered. The room erupted in murmurs, the gallery breaking into waves of hushed conversation. Reporters leaned forward, their pens flying across notepads. Jurors exchanged glances, uncertainty rippling through them like a visible force. Branson opened her mouth as if to object, but for the first time since the trial had begun, she had nothing to say. Lyanna felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Her breath was unsteady, her vision slightly blurred at the edges, but the weight crushing her chest was suddenly gone. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she felt something new. Hope. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. The weight of the FBI's revelations still lingered, but Michael Keene wasn't done. This wasn't just about clearing Lyanna's name anymore. This was about exposing the system that tried to bury her. Keene turned toward the witness stand, his eyes locking onto Hawkins, the man who had placed Lyanna at the scene of the crime. Hawkins looked like he wanted to disappear. His knee bounced beneath the wooden bench, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against his thigh. His eyes darted toward the prosecution's table, where Branson sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't look at him. She wouldn't save him. Keene took a measured step forward. "Mr. Hawkins," he said, voice steady, calm, but carrying an edge sharp enough to slice through the thick air in the room. "Earlier, you testified that you saw my client outside the convenience store, correct?" Hawkins nodded stiffly. "Yeah. You said she was standing near the alleyway, that she looked like she was in a hurry." "That's right." Keene paused, letting the silence stretch just enough to make Hawkins shift in his seat. "Tell me, Mr. Hawkins, how many times have you been arrested?" A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Hawkins blinked rapidly. "What? How many times have you been arrested?" Keene repeated, each word deliberate. "Or would you prefer I pull up your record?" Branson shot up from her seat. "Objection. Relevance." Keene didn't even turn toward her. "Goes to credibility, Your Honor." The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll allow it. Proceed." Keene's gaze never left Hawkins. "Well?" Hawkins' throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I don't know. Try." A heavy pause. Then, 5. Another murmur spread through the room. Keene nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. He turned toward the jury, then back to the witness stand. "And how many of those arrests involved Detective Graham O'Donnell?" Hawkins' face drained of color. His fingers curled against the edge of the stand, his breathing shallow, His gaze flicked toward the back of the room, toward O'Donnell himself, who sat stone-faced, unmoving. Keene took a step closer. "Let me ask you again. Did Detective O'Donnell pressure you into identifying my client as the suspect?" Hawkins froze. For a second it seemed like he wouldn't answer. That maybe he would double down, stick to his lie, hold his ground. But then, his shoulders slumped. His head dipped slightly, and then in a voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't want to." The gasp that followed rippled through the room. Lyanna felt her pulse slam in her ears. Keene stayed on him. "But he made you, didn't he?" Hawkins exhaled shakily, his hands gripping his knees. His eyes flickered toward O'Donnell once more, as if gauging how much trouble he was in. Then, voice raw, "He told me she fit the description. Said it would be easy. That no one would look too hard at it." Lyanna's breath caught. "Did he tell you what to say on the stand?" Keene pressed. Hawkins hesitated. His jaw tightened. Then, barely audible, "Yeah." The judge's gavel slammed down. The gallery erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the quiet hum of realizations sweeping through the courtroom. Branson looked like she had been struck. Keene turned, stepping away from the stand just as the lead FBI agent approached the evidence table. "Agent, do you have information regarding Detective O'Donnell?" The agent nodded, opening the thick manila folder he had carried in. "Detective Graham O'Donnell and his partner, Derek Marston, have been under federal review for multiple instances of false arrests, evidence tampering, and coercing witnesses in previous cases." The room exploded again. Lyanna barely heard the noise. Her entire body felt weightless, her vision swimming as the realization hit her all at once. It was over. The truth was out. Across the room, O'Donnell didn't move. His fingers twitched, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. He knew. He knew this was the beginning of the end. And Lyanna, finally for the first time since this nightmare began, felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. The heavy courthouse doors swung open, and Lyanna Walker stepped out. A blast of cool air met her skin, but it did little to ground her in the reality of the moment. The weight of everything, the sleepless nights, the fear, the crushing silence of a holding cell still clung to her. But there was something else now. Something stronger than exhaustion or fear. Freedom. The staircase leading down to the street was packed with reporters, flashing cameras, and voices rising in urgent questions. Spectators lined the sidewalk, some holding signs, others raising their phones to capture the moment. A city, a nation, had been watching. She had won. And yet, as she stood there, her heart pounding against her ribs, she knew this was just the beginning. A reporter pushed forward, microphone raised. She was young, sharp-eyed, her expression unreadable beneath the flashing lights. "Miss Walker," she called, her voice slicing through the noise, "do you have a message for the people watching?" Lyanna exhaled slowly. She let her gaze move past the cameras, past the microphones, past the sea of eyes locked onto her. Somewhere in that crowd, there were people who had been in her place, people who had been silenced, who had been wrongfully accused and never given the chance to speak. Her fingers curled at her sides. She could still feel the cold bite of the handcuffs against her skin, could still hear the steel door of the holding cell clanging shut, could still remember the look in O'Donnell's eyes when he thought he had already won. For years, she had believed in justice. Then in a single night, she had lost faith in it. And now, she was ready to fight for it. Lyanna lifted her chin, looking straight into the camera lens. Her voice, steady and clear, cut through the chaos. "I wasn't the first to be treated unfairly," she said, her words measured but filled with an undeniable force. "But I will do everything in my power to be the last." A single beat of silence, then applause. It started with one clap, then another, then a rising wave of sound that filled the street, rolling over her like a tide. The cameras flashed, the reporters leaned in. But Lyanna Walker didn't stay to soak it in. She stepped forward, not as a victim, not as a girl who had barely escaped a wrongful conviction, but as a force for change. If you were moved by Lyanna's story and believe in the power of justice, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who need to hear it. Subscribe to stay updated on more powerful stories like this one. Your support means the world to us and gives us the motivation to keep creating meaningful content. Together, we can continue to share stories that inspire change and make a difference. Thank you for being a part of this journey.